I will not be silent. This is my right. And yet, because of who I am, you think I do not belong here?
We follow procedure. That is the rule. Is this really justice or just power dressed as law?
The silence in that courtroom was heavier than any gavel strike. Every pair of eyes lingered on Danielle, a woman refusing to bend under the weight of cold authority. And in that breathless pause, one question rose above the walls. Was this truly justice, or just the shadow of power pretending to be law? The story does not end here. What comes next will test the meaning of fairness in ways no one expected. If this moment speaks to you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe Danielle stood her ground the right way? Leave a comment, and remember to like and follow so the truth can reach even further. The courthouse in Richmond breathed like an old organ, wood sighing under the shuffle of shoes, the faint scent of polish and paper rising with every turn of a page. Morning light slanted through tall windows and laid amber bars across the benches where townspeople sat shoulder to shoulder, coffee cups tucked between their palms from the cafes across the street. Reporters with press badges clipped to their jackets spoke in low, careful tones, their voices skimming over words like arraignment and public interest, before falling back into hush the moment the bailiff stepped forward and called the room to order. Danielle Harris sat at the defense table with her hands folded, her posture steady, her gaze attentive. She dressed without ornament, a simple blouse, a dark blazer, yet there was a stillness in her that drew the room's wondering attention in spite of itself, as if calm had its own gravity. From the bench, Judge William Carter regarded the crowd with a patience that suggested long practice. Lines fanned from the edges of his eyes, his silver hair was combed neatly back. He spoke with the soft authority of someone who had called to order more mornings than he cared to count, and still knew the right pitch to lower a murmur to silence. Across from Danielle, Officer Mark Reynolds sat at the plaintiff's table, uniform crisp, chin lifted. The brass gleamed. He did not look at her. If he felt the weight of the spectators in the rear row, some officers in matching jackets, some neighbors with arms folded, some students clutching notepads, he gave no sign. Ethan Walker arranged his files with the choppy concentration of a beginner trying to look unhurried. The pages made a dry sound, a small weather in his hands. He leaned toward Danielle and spoke softly, just enough for her to hear. He asked if she was all right. She answered with a slight nod, and her eyes returned to the judge. Even from a distance, that attention read as composed, not defiant, present, not passive. It was a sort of attention that made the prosecutor glance up to see who owned it. The bailiff announced the case. People in the gallery adjusted forward, jacket fabric whispering, handbags creaking as straps shifted against wood. Outside, a news van idled at the curb. Through the glass, the square brightened as the sun climbed a finger higher. The season colored everything. The maples on the boulevard were turning, and the red leaf rolled the air like a small boat past a pane of glass. Then was gone. The prosecutor rose. Linda Brooks was meticulous in speech and bearing. Her vowels arranged with care, she laid out the state's account with steady rhythm, the way a teacher might write a sequence on a chalkboard. An officer had answered a call about disturbance near a closed storefront. An individual had refused to identify herself and had escalated the encounter. An arrest had followed. In the prosecutor's telling, each brick clicked into place without dust or splinter. A tidy wall built swiftly before the jury could glance away. Danielle listened without so much as a tilt of the head. Her breathing stayed measured. The judge looked down at his notes. His pen moved once, twice. When the prosecutor finished, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath a beat longer than necessary, as if waiting for the unseen piece that would surely slot next into the state's clean arrangement. Officer Reynolds, the judge said, and a kind of stillness came over the space, the kind that knows how certain rooms love a uniform. Reynolds stood and made his way to the witness stand with steps neither fast nor slow. He took the oath, voice clear, hands steady, and settled into the chair. Up close, the shine of his collar pins was bright enough to put a star in a squint. He began at the beginning, as asked. The street, the hour, the glint of a phone screen in a hand, the refusal to comply. He spoke without hurry, borrowing the confidence of habit. He said the words, uncooperative, then raised her voice, then non-compliant, adding them like weights to a scale he expected to tip in one direction only. He said he had used restraint appropriate to the situation. He said he had been struck. He said there had been a sudden movement toward his sidearm. The phrase hung in the air like a hook on invisible wire. Ethan's pencil jammed against the margin of a page, leaving a small graphite crescent. He set the pencil down and laced his fingers to keep from fidgeting. He glanced at Danielle. She sat with the same composed posture, though the lamplight along her cheekbone sharpened, a quiet angle remarking itself. In the gallery, someone touched another's sleeve and whispered, then remembered they were not in their living room, and fell still. When the prosecutor seated the floor, Ethan rose. He felt his knees more than he expected and breathed once through his nose to steady them. His first questions were simple anchors. Street names, distances, the number of bystanders present. He tested memory against detail in small, steady taps that made no noise and yet could be heard if one listened. Reynolds answered with the bluntness of certainty. The judge watched the exchange as if observing the boy practice scales, measuring the intention, not only the notes. In the pauses, small American things kept happening. A court clerk smoothed a flag on a short pole where its edge had folded. The bailiff's shoe creaked on a seam in the floor. A man in the back row removed his cap, then put it back on, then removed it again and settled it in his lap. People are always doing the little things. You only notice when you know you will remember a morning for the rest of your life. When Ethan concluded for the moment, the judge nodded toward Danielle. The room turned as one, a school of fish in a slow wave. She walked to the stand with the unadorned presence of someone who has learned how to arrive without theater. She took the oath, spoke "I do" in a voice that was neither hard nor soft, and folded her hands on the rail. Brooks began again, this time with questions that leaned forward. Did the defendant understand that officers act for public safety? Did she understand that cooperation can prevent confusion? Did she understand that her refusal to provide identification had consequences? Each question carried its answer alongside it. A coach walking the player to the line where only one choice waited. Danielle answered evenly. She said she had asked the officer what crime she was suspected of. She said she had been on the public sidewalk and had not obstructed anyone. She said she had spoken with respect. Brooks pressed. The words thickened and pushed against each other. The crowd adjusted again. From his bench, Judge Carter raised a palm like a conductor asking the winds to soften. He asked Brooks to keep the question and set aside the speech that wished to travel with it. Brooks nodded, and her next sentence came out spare. Danielle's gaze moved once, not to the jury, not to the cluster of officers near the back, but toward Ethan, who watched her with the air of someone trying to learn in the present tense. She turned back to the attorney and answered another sequence of queries with care. Where were you standing? What did you say first? What did the officer say then? What did you do with your hands? The details nested, little boxes opening to reveal smaller ones. She did not decorate them. She did not use words like always or never. She spoke of the corner of a window frame, of the feel of a flashlight beam on the bridge of a nose, of the way tone changes meaning without changing syllables. A murmur rose near the aisle and fell again, like water on a stone. In the corridor during recess, the hum of the building altered. The vending machine swallowed a bill and rattled a spiral of peanuts forward. A reporter held a paper cup beneath a carafe and filled it with the last of the dark roast, then added a little cream from a small plastic cup he opened with his thumbnail. A woman in a sweater with autumn leaves knitted across the chest told a man that she had never seen so many cameras in one place. He said he had, once, when the governor came to town. They smiled, not unkindly, and drifted back toward the double doors when the bailiff called. Back in the courtroom, the air reset to its early hush. Ethan made a small note to himself in the margin 2 words only, underlined and slid the legal pad an inch to the left. He looked up and met Danielle's eyes. In this room, time had a way of slipping into a slower gear. It made the person aware of their own breath, of the manner in which a heart measures distance in quiet beats. Brooks approached the stand for a final set of questions and stepped aside. Ethan rose again, found a steadier footing than before, and asked in his mildest tone that the witness recount in her own words what she had experienced. The judge nodded. The request was the opposite of theatrical. It asked for plainness. and plainness often reveals more than any flourish. Danielle spoke, not fast. She told of stopping to check her phone near a shuttered shop, of the officer approaching with a beam of white laid directly across her face, of asking what she had done wrong. She described the pause between a question and an answer that did not answer, the way someone's presence can fill a space in a manner different from their body. When she recounted being told that she was uncooperative for asking why, Ethan lowered his gaze to his own shoes so he would not break the spell by nodding. She said she had tried to explain, and the officer had taken her arm. She said she had asked him to let go. Each clause rested squarely on the next. In the third row, a student with a notebook wrote a phrase, scratched it out, then wrote it again in smaller letters. People will often try to capture a moment with the right arrangement of words. Most of the time, a moment refuses to be held that way. The prosecutor lifted a finger and began to object, then dropped it when the judge tipped his head and said he had heard no new show of argument at all, only an answer. Danielle continued without raising her voice. She spoke of pressure along her forearm, of a wall very near her shoulder, of the grain of wood close enough to resolve. She did not say the word violence. She did not need to say it. When she finished, the room did what rooms do when they are full of people who are waiting for someone else to move first. It kept very still. The judge thanked the witness, his tone gentler than at any previous point in the morning, and directed that the court would pause. He rapped the gavel once, and the sound ran outward like a ring on water. The square outside glowed brighter at midday. Through the high windows, a school group crossed the far corner, their teacher counting hats in a voice that sounded like a hymn from this distance. A maple leaf let go of its branch and spun, briefly lit like a small red coin. The news van's antenna adjusted by the width of a thought. A delivery truck pulled to the curb, and the driver hopped down with a carton of paper. Life at every edge of the story kept living, indifferent and faithful. People filtered back in for the afternoon session with new coffee and softer voices. A man in a ball cap held the door for a woman with a cane, and she thanked him, and he tipped an invisible brim in the air. Little courtesies passed hand to hand the way water finds a channel and keeps it clear. On the bench, the judge returned, and everyone rose. Then Saturday, the clock over the door advanced by one careful notch. The prosecutor asked to recall Officer Reynolds for one narrow point, and he answered with the same composed economy, revisiting details he had already spoken with, only the slightest stiffening. Ethan did not press. He saved his breath for the thing that would need it. A reporter in the second row lifted a brow at another and made the smallest motion of her pen, meaning not yet. A whisper of wind found the window frames and made a faint sound in the room, a thread of weather drawn across wood. Danielle sat with the posture of someone who does not need to pretend to be patient because she island. She laid her palm flat upon the table, as if to feel the steadiness of the surface transmit itself to her hand. Every story asks the listener to decide where to stand. This one, early yet, had already persuaded the room to step an inch closer to its center. The judge announced that he would hear one final question for the day. Brooks deferred. Ethan rose. He did not stride, and he did not whisper. He let his voice carry with the companionable warmth of radio played in an old car on an evening drive. He asked Danielle if there was anything about the officer's account that she wished to clarify before the court paused. The phrasing was mild. The space it opened was not. Her gaze tipped fractionally, and the lamplight found her eyes. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. The room lent her all of its attention as naturally as people lend their ears to a melody they did not expect to know. She spoke one sentence, and in the sentence was both invitation and promise. A hand placed gently upon a door the whole town had been told was already closed. Danielle inclined her head, and her eyes brightened. The truth has never been that simple. I tell the gavel's echo faded, but the tale Officer Reynolds had planted did not. It hovered like a verdict that had arrived too early, turning the air to glass. The room resumed its careful breathing. Paper settled. Wooden benches took the weight of familiar bodies, and the old vents along the wall sighed warm air that smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. Outside the high windows, Richmond glowed with that autumn brightness that always makes people talk a little softer. The judge leaned forward with a small, habitual nod, and the prosecutor rose as if she had been waiting there in the moment between heartbeats. Linda Brooks arranged her notes without looking down, a pianist certain of the keys. Her tone was measured, the sort of steady cadence that asks a listener to accept each brick of a story before they glance up to measure the wall. She began with civility and never lost it. She asked whether the defendant understood that officers serve the public good. She asked whether the defendant appreciated that clear cooperation can keep a situation from hardening into confusion. She asked whether, when asked for identification, the defendant provided it without delay. Each question arrived already pressed and starched, as if it had spent all morning under a warm iron. The jury watched with the kind of attention people bring to a familiar hymn. Their faces did not move much, but a pulse of thought passed through the rows like a tide sliding under a pier. Danielle Harris answered in the same even voice she had brought to the stand in the morning. She said she had been on a public sidewalk near a shuttered shop. She said she had asked what crime she was suspected of before offering private details. She said she had spoken respectfully. When the questions tightened, her answers tightened too. Not with heat, but with clarity. Ethan Walker, at the defense table, let his pen rest so he could listen without the scratch of graphite making a fence in his head. Brooks stepped closer by an inch, and her diction cooled another degree. She asked if Danielle had raised her voice. Danielle said no. She asked if Danielle had refused to move along when asked. Danielle said no. She asked if Danielle had questioned the officer's authority. Danielle said she had questioned the officer's reason. Brooks let a thin silence sit between them until the judge tipped his chin, and the prosecutor proceeded. She asked Danielle to describe her hands. Danielle said they were visible at her sides, palms open, when she explained that she was not blocking anyone's passage home. A cough sounded in the back row and wrapped itself in the sleeve before it finished. On the bench, Judge Carter's gaze shifted little by little, the way old clocks keep time by patient degrees. His voice, when he used it, had the warmth of gentle caution. He reminded counsel to keep questions as questions. Brooks smiled a courteous, small smile, the kind a person offers when a good neighbor leans over the fence with advice that cannot be quarreled with, and she kept her phrasing spare. She asked if Danielle remembered exactly what the officer said when he took her arm. Danielle's breath shortened for the span of a blink. Then she answered that she did. Ethan felt the room tighten, not like a fist, but like a stitch pulled firm in a fabric meant to last. When the court broke for a brief recess, life reasserted its ordinary bravely. In the corridor, a cameraman balanced a tripod on his shoulder and said, "Excuse me," twice before passing. A reporter in a navy blazer stirred a little creamer into a cup from the urn and dropped a folded bill in the tip jar perched on the calf cart. A pair of retired teachers who had come down to watch told each other they would only stay another hour and then left, because both knew they would not. Outside the doors, a breeze lifted the corner of a newspaper on the bench, and the red leaf rolled the gust like a small boat. When the bailiff called them back, the room settled into its old hush. Ethan had practiced breathing all morning and found he needed to practice again. Brooks resumed with the calm gravity of a winter river. She asked Danielle whether she had refused to hand over her identification after being told to do so. Danielle said she had asked first what the legal basis was. Brooks asked whether that question, posed in that moment, could be seen as escalation. Danielle said that asking a reason before submitting a document is a way to keep trust intact, and that nothing about her tone had been rough. The prosecutor stepped aside an inch and then back again, reassessing angles the way a gardener tries a spade in earth and listens for the right pitch. The gallery shifted as one organism coat unwrinkled, hands folded or clasped, eyes forward with that particular blend of curiosity and fatigue that gathers on any long day of civic duty. A court clerk straightened the small flag near her ledger. The old vent sighed. Somewhere a phone vibrated mutely and was calmed with a palm. Ethan stood when his turn came and made no speech, only a question. He asked Danielle to describe the beam of the flashlight and where it landed. Across the aisle, an officer in the back row looked down at his watch out of habit and then lifted his eyes, a little ashamed at having thought of the hour. Brooks returned, soft but firm as a nurse, drawing a curtain half closed. She asked Danielle whether she recalled the precise words the officer used when she asked why she was being stopped. The air in the room cooled by a degree that no thermostat will record. Even the floor seemed to listen. Danielle folded her fingers, lifted her eyes to the middle distance where people set their attention when they are reclaiming something memory does not want to touch, and spoke the words exactly as they had been served to her that night. Women like you need to learn how to listen. The sentence landed without a thud. It did not need one. It arrived the way an iron key arrives in the palm. Ordinary metal, uncommon code. The jury did not gasp. They recalibrated. A hand flexed. A yav sat. A pencil hovered, then wrote nothing. Words can be both an instrument and a confession. They filled the room with both moods at once. The judge's mouth thinned by a fraction. He did not speak. He did not need to. Ethan felt the phrase strike a place in him that had been braced all morning without his knowledge. He waited for Brooks to object and then marveled a little when she did not. The prosecutor's face did not show surprise. It showed the care of someone who knows a glass can crack from a sound, not just a blow. She moved slowly for a few questions more, as if stepping through a field that might hold wires. She asked Danielle whether the words had frightened her. Danielle said they had not frightened her so much as confirmed something she had already suspected about the nature of the exchange. Brooks asked whether, after that, Danielle had done anything that could be read as aggressive. Danielle said she had kept her hands visible and had said, "Let go of my arm." The room bent closer without leaning. Ethan rose for a narrow point and asked whether Danielle had been blocking a doorway or leaning against a window. She said no to both. He asked whether she had moved when asked to step aside. She said she had asked where specifically the officer wished her to stand and had complied when told. He said, a small relief uncurling in him like a leaf that had been folded wrong for a long time. The prosecutor changed tactics only in temperature. Her voice cooled further and softened at the edges, which made it more dangerous. She asked whether Danielle had any reason to believe the officer's body camera would not be working. Danielle said she did not know anything about the device beyond the fact that she could see it on his chest and that it later was said to have malfunctioned. The phrase malfunction did its little work in the room. People have relationships with certain words that resemble old acquaintanceships, and malfunctioned is not anyone's friend. Brooks asked if Danielle had any witnesses with her. Danielle said no. Brooks allowed 2 heartbeats to pass before the next question so the ward alone would have time to sit down where it wished. The judge checked the clock above the door with a glance that caught no attention, then returned his gaze to the witness with interest that did. His voice, when he asked for clarity, favored the playing. He wanted a description of the grip on the arm without adjectives. Danielle gave it to him. He wanted the distances in steps rather than in guesses. She gave him steps. The older man in the second row who had taken his cap off earlier and then on and then off again set it finally in his lap and folded his hands over it, the way people do in church when they realize their bodies are prayers even if their mouths are closed. Outside, the day slid toward afternoon, and the light sharpened into that particular gold Richmond wears in October. The calf car restocked its creamers. The barista with a red scarf nodded at her neck, laughed with the deputy, and then lowered her voice, and they tipped well because they were taught to, and because gratitude has a way of loosening a wallet when the world feels large. A school bus sighed as it took a corner on the square. The news van's dish tilted a notch. The simple machinery of a city kept humming. Brooks made one last approach, careful as a doctor lifting a bandage. She asked Danielle whether she believed that asking why could ever be mistaken for disrespect. Danielle said that she understood tone can injure even when words are polite, and that she had chosen her tone with care because she knew rooms can ignite over a spark of heat that no one sees leave the flint. She said that in her life she had learned that keeping steady is not silence and that asking a reason is not contempt. The prosecutor paused, gave a short nod that could have meant anything, and returned to counsel table. Ethan rose for the narrowest of redirects, and the judge permitted it with a palm turned outward, as if offering a small cup of water. Ethan asked Danielle what she had done in the moment after those words were spoken to her. She said she had taken a breath, said again that she was not resisting, and asked the officer to let go of her arm. He thanked her and sat, his throat feeling as if someone had rung a small, clear bell inside it. For a moment, the courtroom sounded like an old house that had been asked to hold its breath for too long. Wood adjusted. Fabric sighed. A window ticked softly as if it knew the outside air would cool the pain again by evening. The judge called a pause to allow counsel to confer. The bailiff announced a brief recess, and people unfolded themselves from their benches and made their way into the hall with the quiet choreography of neighbors who have learned each other's habits over a lifetime of shared errands and shared news. In the corridor, a reporter spoke into a microphone in a voice tuned to carry but not intrude. He chose his words carefully, as people do when they know somebody's grandmother may be listening at a kitchen table with the radio turned up. A woman in a cardigan offered a paper map to a pair of visitors who had driven in from a county over and suggested a diner 2 blocks down for a late lunch. They thanked her, and when the server at the diner brought their coffee, they left a proper tip, because that is what you do in a town that raised you to believe kindness is a kind of currency that must keep moving. When everyone returned, the light through the windows had thinned. The judge asked if there was anything further for the day. Brooks said there was not. Ethan said there was not either. The judge offered instructions for the next morning in the tone of a father reading a card that has come every year on the same day. He lifted the gavel. The room rose and then slowly relented back into itself. And then a small thing happened, which is how large things often signal their approach. In the row just behind the rail, 2 officers shifted. One leaned a shoulder into a whisper, and the other answered with a movement of the mouth that did not disturb the air. Danielle did not turn. She did not need to. She felt something old in the room, something that had learned to expect that hint of fellowship behind a uniform's bright shine. Ethan observed it too, and looked away because he could not bear to look at it full on. From the stand, the witness chair sat empty and seemed to keep the shape of a person the way warm clay keeps the print of a hand after it has been lifted. The bailiff called out the formal close. Papers slid into folders. A coat found a shoulder. Quiet, ordinary sounds braided themselves together. There was, for a heartbeat, a peace that felt almost honest. Then someone laughed under his breath in the back row, the kind of thing laugh men make when they have to replace conviction with something that sounds like it. It skimmed along the wood and dissolved as all small noises do. But the meaning held. Reynolds lifted a cold smile, whispering something to the colleague seated behind him. The screen at the front of the courtroom came to life with a flicker that drew every eye the way a lighthouse draws the gaze of anyone who has ever needed shore. Afternoon light thinned across the tall windows, turning the dust above the rail into slow gold, and the room gathered itself around the rectangle of moving shadow and sound. A low creak travels through the benches as people settle deeper, a kind of human hush that knows when a room is about to hold its breath for longer than is comfortable. Judge William Carter adjusted his glasses and gave the smallest nod to the clerk. The clerk pressed a key. For a heartbeat, there was only the soft rustle of clothing, the faint hum of the vents. And then the video filled the screen shaky, framed by the edge of a car window, its angle imperfect in the way truth often is when it arrives from the hands of a bystander rather than a stage. A flashlight beam slashed white across a woman's face. Her voice, calm and plain, rose into the speakers. "I am not resisting. Let go of my arm." The words carried the ordinary weight of a fact stated and a boundary set. At counsel table, Ethan Walker felt the skin at the back of his neck prick as if a draft had found him. He kept his eyes on the screen and away from the jury so he would not search there for comfort. Across the aisle, Officer Mark Reynolds tightened his jaw until a line appeared that had not been there a second earlier. His hand moved to smooth the crease on the thigh of his uniform. He did not look toward the cluster of officers seated in the rear row, but his shoulders squared as if he felt their tension like a hand between his shoulder blades. The audio crackled, and out of the crackle came the officer's voice, hard, clipped, too loud for the distance shown on the screen. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." The camera shook once as if the person holding it had flinched, then steadied. The woman's tone did not change. "Let go of my arm." The angle offered no theater, only proximity. The dark curve of a cruiser's roofline, the shine of a metal badge, the close grain of a wooden storefront behind them. There was no music to tell anyone what to feel. There was only breath and speech and movement. Someone in the gallery reacted with a quick intake that pulled other breaths along with it. A man put a hand to his mouth and then lowered it, embarrassed without knowing why. In the second row, a student wrote one word, then scratched it out, unsure whether any single word deserved the job. The courtroom held steady, the way a church does when it receives an unexpected confession at a service everyone thought would end exactly on time. Then the sentence that had floated like a rumor all morning arrived as if it had walked through the door and taken a seat in the front pew. Women like you do not get to question me. It came out of the speakers without flourish. A simple arrangement of syllables set at a temperature that burned without flame. The judge's face did not change, but something about his stillness did. He lifted his hand, and the clerk paused the video. The room stayed quiet because there was nothing useful for noise to do. The prosecutor, Linda Brooks, rose with care, as one might stand near a porcelain bowl that already holds a hairline crack. She asked, in her unhurried voice, that the court consider the limits of a partial recording. She noted that angles deceive, that audio can fail to carry tone, that context matters. She did not attack the substance. She asked the room to remember the nature of a lens. She asked permission to question the witness about the minutes before the bystander began recording. The judge nodded, but his pen, when it moved, did not write much. Ethan stood only to say that the defense welcomed questions but believed the words spoken on the recording required no interpreter. He sat as soon as he had said it, unwilling to place his body between what the jury had just heard and what it needed to keep hearing inside each of them. On the screen, the frozen frame showed a hand gripping a forearm. The skin beneath that hand was compressed into a pale ridge. The clerk advanced the video in seconds-long turns, and each turn built a staircase no one wished to climb, but everyone did. When the footage ended, there was a small sound no one could place, the barest click, as if the room itself had swallowed. The clerk blanked the screen, and the space exhaled a murmur that tried to be polite and failed. The judge brought the gavel down once not scolding, just returning the air to order, and invited Brooks to proceed. She approached in a line so straight it might have been drawn by a surveyor. Her nose closed in her hand. She asked Danielle Harris to confirm that, by the time the recording began, the officer had already spoken to her more than once. Danielle said yes. She asked whether Danielle had asked the officer why she was being stopped. Danielle said yes. She asked whether she had raised her voice. Danielle said no. Brooks allowed each answer to sit in the air for the space of one quiet breath before asking the next. She did not sharpen her tone. Instead, she softened it, and the softening made the questions seem like invitations to doubt rather than commands to submit. Ethan recognized the tactic. A winter river does not need speed to be dangerous. Temperature is enough. He rose when permitted and asked two things. Nothing more. He asked Danielle to describe the beam of the flashlight and where it landed. She said it landed full upon her face. He asked whether she had kept her hands visible. She said she had palms open, as anyone is taught to do when the shape of a knight tilts towards something it should not become. He sat, and his chair sounded louder than it should have when he took his weight. The judge asked the clerk to replay a short segment. The speakers carried again the calm sentence set against the glare. I am not resisting. Let go of my arm. The judge's pen moved a little. In the gallery, the man who had covered his mouth earlier lowered his hand to his lap and clasped it with the other as if he were petitioning something older than the court. Outside, the square had taken on the color of late autumn afternoon, that particular gold that makes brick look warmer than it feels under a palm. A school bus sighed at a stoplight. The calf cart in the corridor restocked its paper cups and sugar packets. When the bailiff announced a brief recess, people filed out with the courtesy of neighbors at the end of a long service. At the calf cart, a reporter asked for a refill and left a folded bill in the glass jar. The barista with a red scarf around her neck thanked him and told him to stay warm. He nodded and said he would try. On a bench near the door, two visitors from a county over shared a paper-wrapped sandwich and agreed that they had not expected to spend their day this way. They rose when the bailiff called them back, and one of them smoothed the bench with his palm as if to leave it approvingly for the next person. When the room gathered itself again, the light had thinned further, and the windows held the pale blue of a day ready to let go. The judge asked whether there was additional evidence. Ethan said there was not. Brooks said there was not, with a note of professional regret that did not ring false. She knew the value of leaving a room wanting explanation it would not receive today. She returned to the lectern and asked to recall Officer Reynolds for a narrow point. The judge allowed it. Reynolds walked to the stand with the measured care of a man who knows that every click of a heel will be heard as if it meant something. Up close, his face looked more human than uniform small freckles near one temple, the pale line of an old nick where a razor had once been too sharp for a hurried morning. Brooks asked him whether the statement heard on the recording had been uttered in frustration rather than malice. He said yes. She asked whether, prior to the recording, the defendant had failed to move along when asked. He said yes. She asked whether his body camera had malfunctioned. He said it had. She did not ask why. Ethan did not either. The word carried its own history into the room. Ethan rose for cross and did not raise his voice. He asked whether the officer had used a phrase that separated the citizen before him into a category women like you rather than address her by name. Reynolds said he had not intended to categorize anyone. Ethan asked whether intention changes a wound left by impact. Reynolds did not answer at first. The judge asked him to answer. He said quietly that impact is what it island. Ethan thanked him and Saturday. For a while, the courtroom did what living rooms do in old houses when a storm is passing overhead. It waited inside its own frame. The judge looked at the clock above the double doors and then at the faces before him. He announced that the court would hear a final brief statement before adjourning for the day. He turned his attention toward the defense table. Ethan stood. He did not approach the lectern. He said only that the defense had no argument to add because the room had already heard what mattered. He said again. The choice made him feel like a boy who had put down a toy he loved so that an adult would trust him with something real. The judge prepared to lift the gavel. In the row behind the rail, a low murmur traveled like a thread pulled through fabric, nothing loud enough to earn rebuke, just the sound of two uniforms leaning together for a private word. Danielle did not turn her head. She did not need to see. Some sounds carry their colors without needing light. Ethan's jaw set, then released. The judge brought the gavel down once, and the room rose and scattered into the pale corridors where ordinary life waits to reclaim what extraordinary moments lay down for an hour or two. In the hallway, people resumed what people always resume. Someone asked where the closest diner was, and the deputy gave directions and said the pie was good there this time of year. Someone held a door for a woman with a cane, and she said thank you, and he nodded the way men nod when they want to say more and know that simple is better. A reporter spoke into a microphone in a voice warm enough to accompany a kitchen radio in a house where supper simmered on low. The barista reset the tip jar and smiled at the next person in line as if she knew the city needed kindness like a porch needs light. Danielle and Ethan stepped into the cool draft near the stairwell that always made the old courthouse smell a little like stone. He did not speak. He did not have to. The day had put a line down between morning and evening and asked them to stand on the line and see it for what it was. The stairs seemed longer than they had at noon. Their footfalls made a gentle patter on the worn treads, a rhythm that matched the pulse in Ethan's throat. Back in the courtroom, the clerk powered down the screen. The last of the reporters packed away, coiled cords with the tired grays of people who carried their work like luggage. The officers in the rear row filed out together, shoulder to shoulder, an old drill that did not require a command. The judge's chamber's door clicked shut in a sound that said the day would be measured privately now before it was measured publicly tomorrow. In the fading light, the flags at the front barely stirred, as if remembering a breeze they had loved earlier and would meet again in the morning. Ethan exhaled and glanced at his client. The set of Danielle's mouth had not changed, but the light in her eyes had. She looked up at him not with triumph and not with fear, but with a clarity that belongs to those who can see longer distances than most. She leaned the smallest fraction toward him so that he would not mistake the words for anything but what they were meant to be, steadying, not performance. She kept her voice low for him and only him. This is only the first crack. The night thinned to a quiet ribbon along the county road, and the small house on the edge of Richmond held its own pool of light, like a lantern set out for travelers. Crickets stitched a steady line through the dark. A porch flag barely stirred. Danielle let the screen door ease shut behind her guest and motioned him in with a small tilt of the head that said welcome without ceremony. The living room was simple and neat. A shelf with a row of worn paperbacks about leadership and history, a shadow box on the mantel with a folded flag behind glass, and a framed photograph of a younger woman in a dress uniform standing beside an older man in the same blues, their shoulders touching as if they had learned the same posture from the same long days. Ethan noticed the picture and then looked away, knowing sometimes the most important things prefer not to be stared at. Earlier that afternoon, after court adjourned, he had stopped by a corner calf dog with a bell on the door and bought 2 paper cups of hot tea and a small slice of lemon pound cake, the kind old calves keep wrapped in wax paper on glass stands. He left a tip in the jar because that is what you do when someone hands you warmth without asking too many questions. Now, inside the house, the tea steamed on the coffee table and the sweet, clean scent of citrus drifted just enough to soften the edges of everything. Danielle sat not on the end of a sofa near the door, but slightly more toward the room's center, a habit of placement a person acquires without deciding and then keeps. Ethan eased into the chair across from her with the careful care of a man who knew he was about to be trusted and worried about being worthy of it. He asked if she was sure she wanted to do this tonight. She said there are times when tomorrow is a fine plan and times when it is a way to hide. This was not a hiding day. Her voice did not reach for drama. It set plates on the table and invited Truce to sit down. He took a sip of tea that was a little too hot and kept it anyway because his hands needed something to hold on to. She rose and crossed to the bookcase and slid a leather folder from between 2 hardbacks. The leather was smooth and scarred in the old way, as if it had ridden a lot of miles in a single bag. She set it on the coffee table and rested her palm on it for a moment, then lifted it open and let Ethan see what lay inside. Dates written in the tidy hand of a clerk, commendations etched in official blue, training certifications that stretched across the better part of 2 decades, photographs in which the faces were plain and direct in a way cameras rarely catch now. He kept his breath even, the way he had trained himself to do in court when a witness said something that wanted to pull him forward out of his chair. She told him, without drumroll, that she had served for 20 years and had retired with the rank of lieutenant commander. She did not say the names of places, but he could hear the shape of distances in the quiet spaces between her sentences. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knows that one true sentence is worth 10 decorated ones. She did not lean on titles. She did not need to. They had leaned on her for long enough, long ago. She did not tell war stories. That is not what this night was for. She told him instead about learning how to breathe through a small space and still fill her lungs, about making decisions at the pace of consequence and then making peace with them at the pace of human hours. She told him that being trained to keep calm does not mean you have no storm in you. It means you have a way to steer when the weather turns. He listened like a man who had found himself on a road with no shoulder and now, suddenly, saw that it widened onto solid ground. He asked what she wanted him to do with this. She said to understand it. First, because it would be useful tomorrow, but also because a person should not have to be introduced to her own life by the opposing counsel. He smiled without showing teeth and said he could promise at least that much. He turned a page as if the paper were thin glass and the evening would break if he rushed. She watched him watch the documents, and for a minute the room held a quiet the way a porch holds shade in the late part of a summer day. The refrigerator hummed and stopped. The crickets outside changed their rhythm by a fraction. Somewhere down the road a car passed, slow, and then the sound slid off into the woods, the way water leaves a stone. He asked if the defense should reveal this outright in the morning or hold it until the right question asked for the right answer. She said the difference between secrecy and strategy is whether you are hiding or timing. She did not want to hide. She also did not want to throw truth into a room like a spark and hope the place did not catch. He nodded. He knew about sparks and rooms. He had lived in both. He looked again at the photograph on the mantel. The younger woman in dress blues had the same posture Danielle had carried in court, the same straightness that never once felt like pride, only presence. He asked who the man was. She said he had been her commanding officer and her mentor and the person who had taught her that a word like integrity lives in the dark when no one's looking, not just in the light when the cameras want a quote. He had been buried with honors and a quiet service a few years back, and on that day, the sky had done what skies do in this part of the state. It had opened, briefly, as if to say a storm could crash through but had chosen not to. Ethan said the video had been enough to change the room's breathing today. She said rooms breathe the way people in them do. Show them something undeniable and their ribs will move in a different way. He asked if she was ready for the morning. She said she had been ready for a long time, and that readiness is a kind of rest, not a kind of strain. The way she said it made him think of ropes properly coiled, of engines tuned, of boots polished, not for shine but because the first thing you control in this world is your own discipline. They talked through the flow of the next day, the way travelers trace a route with the blunt end of a pencil on a paper map. They spoke about when to stand and when to let silence do their work. They spoke about the prosecutor's habit of softening her tone when she wanted to lay a trap and the judge's steady patience that suggested a mind open to a properly placed fact. They spoke the way two people speak when both know something is heavy and neither wants to make the other carry it without saying so. She closed the folder and set it aside, then reached for the shadow box on the mantel and carried it to the coffee table. The folded flag behind glass looked smaller up close, as if it had been held by so many hands that it had learned to become the size of a hand. She rested her fingers lightly against the glass and said that some days you carry a symbol and some days a symbol carries you. Tonight, she needed the weight in her palm to remind her that weight can be a comfort when it has been earned. She told him that her calm in the street and in the courtroom had not been silence, and it had not been fear. It had been the sort of composure a person keeps when she has spent years learning how to measure a room for danger and dignity at the same time. She said that the officer had misread that composure as challenge and that the line between misreading and misuse is thin enough to cut a person if they are not careful. He said he would find the words to make the jury feel that line without having to see it. She said he would not have to do it alone. He confessed that he had been afraid of the morning in a way he could not admit in the courtroom without weakening what needed strength. She said, fear is not the enemy of courage. Sometimes it is a field where courage finally grows tall enough to be seen. The way she said it made the room less small. He said he had never thought of it like that. She said she had to. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked once and stopped, as if reminded that night is a kind of promise in this part of the world and not to be interrupted without reason. A moth tapped once against the porch light and then lost interest. The tea cooled. Ethan offered a slice of pound cake, and she laughed, soft. The laugh of a person pleased by small, human gestures after a day spent with large, institutional ones. They ate in companionable quiet. He told her that in the morning he would carry in his head the smell of lemon and tea and the sound of crickets as insurance against whatever voices in the courtroom try to declare themselves the only reality. She told him that insurance like that pays better than most. He asked about the body camera and whether they would ever know for certain why it had failed. She said she did not expect certainty from a device that had already declared itself unreliable, and that she intended to give the jury a better instrument to measure the room, their own sense of fairness. He liked that plan because it did not require a gadget or a technician with charts. It required only the oldest things courts exist to test what people believe is right when no one is standing over them with a stick or a rulebook. She walked him to the door when it grew late enough that the thin ribbon of night along the road had widened into a proper field, and the chill in the air asked folks to see themselves home. On the porch, the two of them stood for a moment and listened to the dark breeze. A neighbor's porch light winked out 3 houses down. A pair of owls traded a low question and answer. Across the field, the lights of the city sat on the horizon like a congregation of small, patient ships. Ethan thanked her, not for the documents, though he meant that, but for trusting him inside the house of this part of her life. She said trust is the only bridge that does not wash out in a storm if it is built right the first time. He said he hoped he was building right. She said he was taking careful steps, which is how any good bridge starts. He laughed softly and said he would try to keep his knees from knocking in the morning. She said the trick is to let them knock but keep walking. He stepped down onto the path and then turned back because something in him did not want to take the dark road without a last word to anchor him. She anticipated the turning. She had the folder under her arm again, as if returning a book to its shelf after a night of honest use. The porch light made a warm circle around her, and he understood for the first time that circles like that exist so people can step into them and remember what shape they want to keep when they step back out. He said he would see her at the courthouse after the morning's first bell. She said yes, and that he should eat something with protein even if nerves did not permit appetite, and drink water whether he thought to or not, and leave the house 10 minutes earlier than he believed necessary, not because of traffic, but because being there before he had to be would bring down the noise in his head. He said he would do exactly that. He told her that her calm had already changed the way he thought about his own. She said that is how calm works when it is real. It multiplies. He reached for the handle of his car door and then rested his hand on the roof instead, wanting the night to hold still one beat longer so he could carry it unbroken to morning. He looked across the field toward the faint glow that meant downtown and court and microphones and all the instruments of public life. He felt the old worry reach for him and then let it pass. When he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He just gave the truth a clear doorway into the day that waited. Tomorrow, everything will explode. Dawn put a thin frost along the courthouse steps and a pale shine on the bronze statue in the square. And yet the moment the door swung open, the building warmed with bodies and breath and the low thrum of expectation. People moved with the courtesy of a small southern city, used to lines that bend and strangers who say good morning. A deputy held the door for an older couple. A reporter lifted a hand in thanks to the barista, who slid a fresh pot into the calf cart and tucked a folded bill into the tip jar. A high school civics class filed past under a teacher's watchful eye. Inside the courtroom, the wood held the night's chill for only a heartbeat, then surrendered to the heat of a day that had been waiting to speak. Judge William Carter took the bench with a measured nod that quieted the benches faster than the gavel ever could. His silver hair caught the weak light and made a kind of halo that looked nothing like indulgence. He glanced at counsel's tables, at the jury, at the witness chair, and the air settled into a steady listening. The clerk called the case. The bailiff's voice, deep and familiar, asked all to rise and then to be seated, and the murmur that had lingered around the edges of the room retreated into the polite privacy of folded hands. Ethan Walker had arrived early, as instructed by his client on the porch the night before, and early had done its work. His tie lay flat. His papers were in simple stacks. The tremor that had visited his hands during yesterday's session had learned, if not obedience, at least manners. Danielle Harris sat beside him, blazer a calm navy, posture unforced and straight, face composed in that way that never mistakes silence for surrender. Across the aisle, Officer Mark Reynolds ran his thumb once along the ridge of a pen and set it down as if the pen had disappointed him. From the first sentence, the day moved with the crisp economy of a seasoned broadcast. The prosecutor, Linda Brooks, announced nothing more ambitious than a brief review of yesterday's evidence and the calling of 2 witnesses. She spoke in lines that never smudged. She knew when to add warmth and when to remove it. She began with a neighbor who had been walking his dog near the corner where everything started. The neighbor offered what he had seen and no more. She asked a technician to explain the limits of a bystander's phone microphone. He did so without condescension. Her case, this morning, wore the clothes of prudence. When it was time, Ethan rose for a motion that had lived in his briefcase for days and on his desk for weeks. He asked the court to omit a set of internal summaries compiled by the department's own reviewers' documents that bore dates and signatures, and that recorded complaints lodged against Officer Reynolds over a period of years, together with notes about outcomes and discipline. He did not use the word pattern. He did not have to. The judge listened. The prosecutor objected with care, and then, seeing where the weather was headed, objected again with less force. The judge allowed a narrow path. The summaries would be omitted for a limited purpose. The jury would be told exactly what that purpose was and what it was not. The law prefers fences to open fields. Paper moved from hand to hand like a quiet tide. The jurors bent their heads as the clerk read a line here and a line there, the way a person tastes a stew before deciding how much to ladle into a bowl. No one rushed. The room took the measure of each entry. A date written out in careful script, a description that did not travel beyond its verbs, a conclusion hatched in official caution. The words did not raise their voices. They did not need to. They gathered. When the clerk finished, the judge turned toward the defense table. His gaze stopped at Danielle. She stood and walked to the witness chair with the unadorned steadiness of someone who has traveled more than one kind of distance. She took the oath, the same simple promise spoken by everyone who sits in that chair, and folded her hands on the wooden rail. Ethan asked no preface. He asked only that she tell the court who she had been before this case asked her name. Her answer did not search for the room. It knew the room would come to it. She said she had served her country for 20 years. She said she had retired with the rank of lieutenant commander. She did not list medals. She did not name theaters. She did not lay maps on the table or ask for admiration as payment. She said she had been trained to keep calm in places where calm does not visit without being invited, and that calm is a discipline learned the hard way, not a trick performed for applause. She said that on the night in question, she had measured her breath and her words the way she had been taught to do when the temperature of a moment threatens to melt what is right. Brooks rose with respect and asked 2 questions, designed to make the jury consider whether training could make a person read ordinary conflict as threat, and thus escalate where others would not. Danielle answered by describing the difference between scanning and suspecting, between vigilance and provocation. She used no jargon. She spoke like someone offering a neighbor a cup of water, not like someone building a ladder to climb above them. The jury listened with bodies that had loosened by a fraction. Ethan resumed. He carried no theatrics to the lectern. He asked about the words that had been played aloud in the courtroom the day before, the ones everyone now carried like a small stone in a pocket. He asked how those words felt when they were placed upon her, and he asked what she did in the breath that followed them. She said she did what she had been taught when heat enters a room. She slowed the air in her lungs, she made her hands visible, and she refused to let someone else's anger make her its instrument. She said she asked the officer to let go of her arm. She said she did not raise her voice. The room's center of gravity shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a ship finds its keel after a crosswind. A reporter in the second row, who had spent years training her ear to hear when a story turns its face toward the light, lowered her pen without realizing she had. Outside, the square held a small crowd now. Neighbors on their lunch hour, passers-by drawn by the lit windows and the talk on the radio, a handful of officers in uniform standing with their arms folded in a loose line that looked less like solidarity than habit. The cough cart did steady business in coffee and sweet tea. People left decent tips because that is what a town does when something heavy settles on its shoulders, and it wants to remember that kindness is muscle, not decoration. Inside, the judge permitted one more witness, and the courtroom watched a member of the department's oversight staff explain how complaints move through the system and how some die there. The witness did not have the look of a crusader. He had the look of a man who had learned to color inside lines drawn by other hands. He described forms and procedures and review boards. He used the word substantiated and the word unsubstantiated the way clerks use stamps, with a touch practiced into a rhythm years ago. Ethan asked whether a complaint that is not substantiated can still be instructive. The man said yes, and the yes seemed to surprise him a little, like a dog hearing its own bark and liking the sound. By the time the witness stepped down, the day had lifted itself to its true height. The judge asked if counsel had anything further before the midday recess. Brooks said yes. She wished to recall the defendant for one question. The judge allowed it. The prosecutor approached not as a predator and not as a friend, but as a professional who understood that tone makes architecture as surely as lumber does. Her voice found that middle register radio hosts use when they want to carry a listener through an intersection without making anyone feel hurried. She asked whether the defendant believed that her service should place her above ordinary expectations for citizens in a street encounter. Danielle said no. She said service, properly kept, makes a person more accountable to the quiet laws that bind neighbors to each other, not less. The line landed with the soft authority of a hymn refrain. The judge nodded once and turned to Ethan. He asked if the defense wished to add anything. Ethan lifted a palm in thanks and said, The defense believed the record now spoke plainly. He did not say more. The courthouse, long acquainted with speech that tries to fill every corner, recognized the discipline and approved. Then something shifted that had nothing to do with argument and everything to do with the restless way. Truth pulls at a thread until fabric begins to confess its weave. A young reporter near the aisle rose halfway as if to leave, then sat back down, then rose again with a quick apology of a person caught between courtesy and news. She whispered to a colleague, who passed a note forward. The clerk read it, frowned in the way clerks frown when duties multiply, and carried it to the bench. The judge glanced at the paper and lifted his gaze toward counsel. "Counsel," he said, "it appears a statement from the department has been released during these proceedings. The court reminds all that what happens outside these walls is not evidence. We will proceed on the record before us." But the room had already tasted the hint of smoke that precedes a public relations fire. Brooks kept her eyes on the lectern. Ethan kept his eyes on his client. The gallery kept his eyes on Officer Reynolds. Ethan rose once more, as if called by a bell only he could hear, and asked permission for a single, narrow question to the witness just seated. The judge allowed it. Ethan approached the oversight staffer with the air of a man asking a neighbor to borrow a tool he intends to return clean. He asked whether an officer's repeated exposure to similar complaints, regardless of how each ends, can erode public trust. The witness said softly that it can. He added, after a heartbeat, that it does. The words did not clang. They settled. The judge thanked the witness and, with a sense for timing that lives in people who have carried the room a long way, announced that the court would break and reconvene after the midday hour. The bailiff spoke. The benches emptied into the corridor with a gentle rustle of coats and the small music of paper cups. The square outside filled and shifted like a tide. At the diner 2 blocks down, the lunch crowd leaned toward television screens mounted above booths, while plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes cooled, because watching takes both hands. In front of the courthouse, a local pastor placed a hand on the parishioner's shoulder and said that patience is not passivity and that justice does not wear a watch like ours. People nodded. Some prayed without looking like praying. Some called home and promised they would be later than planned and that they would pick up milk on the way. When the courtroom gathered again, afternoon light burned a richer gold along the high windows. The judge returned. The clerk called for order. The day moved into its final waiting posture. Ethan did not look at his papers. He looked at his client and found the same calm she had promised him on the porch. He rose, not to grandstand, but to ask permission for Danielle to finish what the morning had begun. The judge, whose face had the thoughtful wariness of a man who has learned that the shortest distance between 2 points is still sometimes a story, nodded. Danielle spoke into a silence that welcomed plain language. She told the jury that the uniform across the aisle had not made her his enemy. His words had done that by placing her in a category and then treating the category as a rule. She told them that categories are easy and people are not, and that the work of a citizen is to insist on the difference even when it would be more comfortable to let the easy thing win. She said the words without heat, and her lack of heat gave them temperature. Ethan asked no more questions. Brooks, perhaps recognizing that the room had reached the height it could stand without wobbling, declined further across. The judge turned to the jury with a brief instruction about how to hold what they had heard until formal closing would give them a structure for it. His voice, at the end, softened. The quiet afterward felt like a held note in an old song, familiar, patient, suffused with something beyond grief and short of relief. A child somewhere in the building laughed once, a bright thread in the dark fabric, and then the sound disappeared into the corridors. On the witness stand, the officer's face had found a pallor that looked like the color of a morning after a bad night. A drop of sweat formed where the hairline begins to think about retreating. He stared at the far wall as if it might give him a different version of the afternoon. The room, which had shifted its sympathy foot by foot all day, finished that small migration. Reynolds broke the silence he had been warned to keep. He leaned forward, and the words came out a shade too fast and a shade too loud, as if they had insisted on leaving before he had decided whether to let them. "She's lying." And the entire courtroom turned to him with doubtful eyes. The foreperson of the jury stood with the quiet resolve of someone accustomed to speaking at church suppers and school assemblies, and in that settled voice announced the verdict that had been forming all day like weather at the horizon. The words came one at a time, each set down on the air as plainly as a plate on a table. Not guilty. For a heartbeat, the courtroom held its breath, the way a house holds still when thunder moves past. Then relief breathed through the benches. Not wild, not unruly, but human and grateful. The soft sound the room makes when it chooses to become itself again. Judge William Carter inclined his head, the gesture small and sufficient, and asked for order with a tone that carried both dignity and ease. He thanked the jurors, who had done their civic work as neighbors do without spectacle, without stinges, and directed the clerk to record the decision. Ethan Walker did not look at his hands to confirm they had stopped their old trembling. He knew without checking. He looked at his client instead, and in her face he found not triumph and not surprise, but that deeper acknowledgement people reserve for moments that confirm rather than confer who they are. Danielle Harris sat very still, as if stillness itself were a way to honor the room. Across the aisle, Officer Mark Reynolds kept his gaze on a fixed point at the far wall, a man suddenly aware that a wall can refuse to hold the story you ask it to reflect. In the row of uniforms near the back, shoulders shifted in a pattern that could have been discomfort or could have been the body's old search for formation when none had been called. The judge brought the gavel down once, not to scold a cheer that had not come, but to mark the distance between decision and what must follow it. He spoke with that American gentleness that never mistakes softness for surrender. He directed that the defendant be released and restored, that her bond be discharged, that the record reflect what the jury had decided. He added one more sentence, not long and not grand. The court would transmit the record of the admitted summaries to the proper authorities for review. The room heard the word review and let it mean what it would mean in offices, where fluorescent light lays its own kind of judgment on paper. Outside the tall windows, afternoon in Richmond had reached its golden hour, the kind that makes brick glow and the leaves along the boulevard look like small lamps burning low. A school bus sighed at the light and then moved on. The cart in the corridor replaced a stack of cups and reset the tip jar with the ritual care of a station that knows its job is to keep people steady. The bailiff called a formal close of session, and the benches released their patient cargo into the hall. People spoke in the voices they use in grocery stores and sanctuaries and post offices, ordinary, considerate, threaded with feeling but trimmed of harm. Reporters lifted microphones, not like weapons but like instruments meant to carry sound. A deputy held the door and earned a thank you with a nod. A grandmother told a teenager to tuck his shirt in before a camera saw him, and he did, smiling the sheepish smile of boys loved into better behavior. Down the block at the diner, plates of meatloaf and green beans waited, while the lunch crowd watched the screens above the booths, and even those who did not pray set their cups down for a second and let their silence say what they meant. Back in the courtroom, before the last of the press coiled their cords and the clerk capped her pen, the judge invited the defendant to collect her belongings and depart. Danielle rose. The wooden floor answered with a small creak. The old courthouse's way of saying it had seen many departures, and would hold this one too, with care. Ethan gathered his papers into simple stacks and slipped them into his worn briefcase, the leather softened by years of errands no one filmed. He did not rush. He had learned, in the space of a few heavy days, that haste steals from meaning what patience sets aside for it. They stepped into the corridor together and were greeted not by a roar but by that warm, low murmur a community makes when it is deciding, over and over again, to be decent. A reporter asked for a word. Danielle nodded, not out of appetite for the lens, but out of respect for neighbors who would be listening at their kitchen tables and in their cars, radios tuned, supper simmering low. They moved toward the courthouse steps, and the door opened onto the square with its clean lines and its bronze statue and its slow traffic that never quite resents stopping for pedestrians. On the top step, she paused, not for effect, but to measure the air. The cameras found their places. A microphone tilted toward her the way a person leans an ear when they mean to understand. Behind the encircled press, people pressed closer and then checked themselves and made a little room for others, an old Southern choreography composed of manners and shared space. Ethan stood at her shoulder, a half step back, willing his breath to be a kind of shelter. She spoke the way she had spoken in the witness chair, unadorned, steady, the voice of someone who knows that truth prefers plain clothes. She said she was grateful for a jury that listened with care and not with hurry. She said she was grateful for a judge who kept a fair room. She said that what happened in there belonged not only to her, but to every neighbor who has ever wondered whether the rules would protect them or swallow them, and to every officer who wears the badge in honor rather than habit. Then she raised her eyes slightly, not seeking the horizon but studying the middle distance where towns keep their promises. I once fought for this country on distant ground, she said. Today, I had to fight for justice on my own, and truth has prevailed. The words did not rush ahead of themselves. They settled into the crowd and into the microphones, and out along the thin wires and buried cables and invisible frequencies that carry news towards supper tables and truck cabs and quiet living rooms where people sit with their feet on ottomans and listen, because listening feels like a way to belong. A woman in a cardigan put a hand to her mouth and then lowered it and smiled. A young man near the curb straightened his shoulders as if someone had remembered his name. The barista from the corridor cafe, on a break, leaned against the railing and let her eyes shine for a moment before she put her apron back on. Across the steps, Reynolds stood with his counsel near the shade of a column, pale in the way long afternoons can make a person. He did not speak. The department's statements dry as paper, careful as a press suit, had gone out earlier in the day. It promised a review. It invoked policy. It asked for patience. These are the words institutions reach for when they have nothing better yet, and the crowd let the words pass by them without catching. Ethan felt, as he sometimes did in the quiet after a storm, the urge to reach for the ordinary. He told his client they would need to stop by the clerk's office to sign a form that would take longer than a person might think. She smiled at the accuracy of that prediction. He said he would call his mother on the drive home and tell her to set the radio to the public station because the sound would be kinder there. She told him to eat before he made any speech longer than 3 minutes, and he said he would. He meant it. Around them, small American things kept happening. A child asked a question that a parent answered softly so the child would learn the shape of kindness. A passerby handed a bottle of water forward and then vanished into the crowd without waiting for thanks. A pastor said patience again, because sometimes the second time is for the speaker as much as for the listener. Someone started a prayer under their breath that no one needed to name to recognize. The bronze statue took the late light and wore it like an old friend. When the questions finished and the microphones withdrew by degrees and the television vans began their slow pack-up coiling cables, stowing tripods, lowering dishes, the square did not empty so much as settle. A breeze moved through the maples and set a few leaves sailing. People lingered the way neighbors linger at the end of a funeral or a wedding, unwilling to step back into ordinary time without letting the moment bless them once more. Danielle stood a little to the side and reached out to shake a hand. Then another, each grip firm but not hard, the way you greet someone you might see in the produce aisle next week and want to recognize with ease. They made their way down the steps one slow flight at a time. At the curb, a sedan waited with its hazard lights winking their patient metronome. A deputy offered to walk them to the car and then, seeing they were fine, tipped 2 fingers from the brim of his cap and returned to the door. An older couple approached with the small, earnest steps of people who have learned to move across busy places without drama. The woman took Danielle's hand in both of hers and said only thank you, and that was enough. Ethan opened the passenger door and set his briefcase on the floorboard like a tired dog settling by the hearth. Danielle paused with her hand on the roof and looked back at the stairs and the gathering. In the glow of late day, you could see how a place holds the imprint of what it has witnessed, the way soft ground keeps the shape of a shoe for a while after the walker has gone. She breathed in not to fix this moment in amber, but to join it to the long string of ordinary moments that would need tending now that the loud part was done. Across the street, a woman lifted a handmade sign that was more hopeful than artful. A teenager asked his grandfather what justice means when it finally arrives. The grandfather said it means work gets fair for a while and then you keep working. A man in a suit put his phone down and looked up. Really looked the way you do when a story asks you to choose where you stand and you decide to stand with what is right rather than what is easy. Someone began to clap, not in a cheer, but in that slow, steady way church people clap when the truth has been spoken and everyone needs a rhythm to carry them into the next thing. The evening drew itself gently across the city. Porch lights clicked on along side streets. The diner 2 blocks down served another round of coffee and slices of pie that tasted like memory. Radios in kitchens spoke the day back to those who had missed it. In houses where prayers are said, prayers were said. In houses where they're not, grateful silence did the job. The courthouse, relieved of its crowd, stood and held the twilight the way old buildings do tall. A little weary, still willing. Danielle stepped away from the car once more because some part of her understood that the day wanted one last stillness before it was given to history and rumor and replay. She moved back toward the shallow arc of cameras because there's a thing a person owes a town when the town has given her a fair hearing. She did not raise her hand. She did not lift her chin. She simply stood where everyone could see her. A neighbor among neighbors, a citizen among citizens, and let the truth of the day rest on her shoulders the way a shawl rests warm, earned, not heavy. Cameras flashed and the crowd chanted, "Justice, justice," and Danielle's image became a new symbol. In the quiet after the verdict, the courthouse seemed to breathe again, as if its walls had been waiting for fairness to feel them. What remained in memory was not the clamor of lawyers or the weight of uniforms, but the steady grace of a woman who refused to let anger speak louder than dignity. Her story reminded us that justice is not only decided in courtrooms. It is lived each day when neighbors treat one another with honesty and respect. Like the slow glow of a porch light at dusk, even a single act of fairness can guide us through the darker corners of our communities. Take a moment to notice the quiet strengths around you, and if this story has touched your heart, consider passing its warmth forward to someone who may be waiting for light.